And so trying to open the PowerPoint that I had prepared might be problematic. We'll see how it goes as I go through the talk. Thank you again for the introduction. Again, my name is Joseph Basciani. I'm the Director of Operations for StormGeo's office in Houston, Texas. StormGeo is a private weather consulting firm, and we're based in Bergen, Norway, with the headquarters. We have forecast offices all over the world. We do what we call our Weather Insights division of our company is forecast offices in Houston, in Bergen, Norway, in Aberdeen, Scotland, and in Dubai. And those forecast offices are forecasting 24/7 around the world for what we would call traditional weather hazards. Those weather hazards include both marine and onshore interests, as well as tropical weather, energy forecasting, energy trading, and a number of other specialty applications. We're working on a new program that I'll get into here in a little bit called Grid Eyes. It's a collaboration that we're doing with the European Space Agency to use high-resolution satellites to protect power grids. We also have another division of our organization that focuses on optimal ship routing for the shipping industry, particularly bulk carriers and tankers. And they have forecast offices in Sunnyvale, California, and Aberdeen, Scotland, co-located with our Weather Insights forecast office there, as well as in the Hudson Valley of New York. And so between them, we're talking between 9 and 10 different facilities around the world. I apologize for the somewhat haphazard nature of my speaking. I'm being badly distracted by this unhappy network, but I will continue to endeavor to adapt and overcome, as we all are in this day and age of COVID. So our forecast office in Houston has a number of different specialties that we focus on. Our area of responsibility is, generally speaking, North and South America, as well as West Africa. We did recently acquire another forecasting company in Brazil called Climatempo. It's the biggest forecasting company in Brazil, and we're going to be soon transferring our South American and Western Africa forecasts over to them for completion. Which will leave the Houston office covering the North American market. That will include everything north of the equator, although we may give some of the stuff down near the equator in Guyana area over to them. Just can someone confirm the Zoom is still working? Can someone unmute?
Yes, it's working.
You're doing good.
Okay. All right. Yeah, everything was frozen on my end, so I wasn't sure if it was still working or if the network download had completely locked up. So our forecast office in Houston is going to be focusing on the North America market, which is generally speaking going to be everything north of the equator. We may give some of the stuff offshore Guyana over to our Brazil office, simply from a standpoint of they may want Spanish language support or Portuguese language support, both of which are supported out of their office. So we're going to focus our talk here on North America. In North America, our forecast office is generally broken up into 3 different forecast desks. We have an onshore forecast desk, which focuses on what most people would tend to call weather. When you tell people that you're a weather forecaster, they think, oh my goodness, snowstorms, severe weather, tornadoes. That's what the onshore team is focused on. They focus on helping clients in a number of different verticals, everything from banking to hospitality to retail to healthcare and government, overcome the weather challenges that they see completing their operations safely and efficiently in the onshore environment. Most people wouldn't even think of offshore as an environment. So instead of calling it onshore, we tend to call it something called cross-industry. And that is a more generic term that people seem to like better than just calling it onshore. Of course, you're forecasting for onshore. Where else would you be forecasting for? Well, where else you would be forecasting for is offshore. We're doing a lot of forecasting for our offshore oil and gas interests in the Gulf of Mexico and Bay of Campeche in particular, but also in diverse areas like the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, off the U.S. West Coast, all the way out to Hawaii, and including in the Great Lakes. We have a number of terminal clients in the Great Lakes who require wind and wave forecasting to be able to safely offload the tankers and barges that bring the petroleum product into their facilities. And then we have a third forecasting desk that focuses solely on tropical weather. That desk is the tropical weather expertise desk for the entire globe for the organization. So both for weather insights and for shipping, and both in the Indian Ocean and the Northwest Pacific, Northwest Australia, wherever there's tropical activity, our forecasters on the Tropics Watch desk are focusing on that activity, and they are forecasting for track and intensity of these tropical cyclones for our clients on a worldwide basis. Even storms that would seem to be in the middle of nowhere and not bothering anybody. They didn't used to have to bother us, but now that we have a shipping division, we have to keep track of those storms even that are mid-oceanic, and provide the proper wind radii and gale force winds and stuff to keep those ships safe at sea. So it's a very dynamic and diverse office in terms of the amount of weather forecasting that we handle. The majority of what we do these days is risk communication. When I was in your position 25 years ago, lo these many moons ago, coming out of college, our professors would tell us that the computer models are meteorological cancer. That's the word they would use, meteorological cancer, in that if you learn to depend on them too much, you would end up dying as a forecaster, because you wouldn't be able to tell when they were off base and be able to properly predict the weather. And the fact of the matter is, for most circumstances, the computer models have continued to improve to the point that if you look at, take an objective look at verification scores, mean absolute error scores, and QQ numbers, there's very little that forecasters are adding to the actual quality of the forecast, particularly in the near term, to the point where even the National Weather Service is putting in and implementing restrictions on how and when their forecasters can deviate from the official blessed and blended ensemble approach that they are trying to use as a cohesive forecast. And so as a result, the field is transitioning to really being more about risk communication. Who can communicate that risk properly to the proper audience at the proper time in order to make what is essentially data into actionable intelligence and information. So you're the expert in the data. You're the one who knows if the models are differing, which model has been performing better, which model tends to perform better in this particular type of situation. And you are still using some degree of experience in picking out, no, that doesn't look right. That doesn't look right at all. And sifting through that data to provide the information, the next level of information to the client that they need to make their decision to save their life and property the way that they need to keep operating safely and efficiently. So as a result, one of the areas that I would encourage all of you guys to focus on is especially public speaking. Being good and effective written communicators is also extremely important. It's, at least in my opinion, as important as being relatable and personable on a phone or on a web call with the client, that the client can see and have confidence in what you're telling him, and you're able to effectively communicate that without communicating unintended uncertainty or risk or just, an air of not being confident in what you're expecting to happen. So when I'm evaluating resumes now, one of the first things that I'm looking for is strong written communication skills. Written communication skills are very important. I don't just mean avoiding typos, because anyone can have a typo. But is your resume well constructed? Is it good looking? Does it flow properly? And then beyond that, when I'm doing in-person interviews or I'm doing phone interviews, I'm looking for someone who can be an effective communicator. They can be able to say what's on their mind with confidence, not come across as argumentative, combative, or arrogant, obviously. But they have to be able to be personable, be relatable, and make a client understand that this is somebody who really does have their best interest at heart and is looking out for their interests. Because as good as the computer models get, and they've gotten good, as I said, the average business executive or HSE executive or a plant manager or branch manager or whatever level of client you're dealing with is not a weather expert. And so they are counting on you to be that weather expert and tell them what's going to happen so they can make the right decisions. And as a result, if you really want to have a productive career in this field, being an effective communicator is what's going to be needed to get you to that next level. At any rate, back to StormGeo, got a little bit sidetracked there. StormGeo is a forecasting company that serves the globe. We serve a number of different areas. One of the major areas that we're moving into most recently is in energy trading, and especially in Europe. We've recently acquired another energy trading and energy forecasting company in Norway called Nina Analytics. That company specializes in energy trading and forecasting, particularly on the wind and hydro market, which are very big in Scandinavia. And long-range forecasting is actually becoming a very increasingly important part of our portfolio because of that. Energy traders are wanting to be able to trade not only on the day, is it going to be 93 degrees versus 96 degrees today, but also on the longer-term trends. Is there going to be abnormally high amount of wind offshore in the second quarter and third quarter of this year for generation purposes, or are we going to need to plan to buy energy on the open market somewhere else because the wind is not going to be as vigorous this year and we're going to get less production out of our offshore wind farms? Things like that have become a big part of what we do at StormGeo. StormGeo continues to evolve in terms of what we have to offer. It's an increasingly competitive marketplace, as I'm sure you're all aware. As I mentioned earlier, one of our most recent collaborations is a project called Grid Eyes, which is a collaboration with the European Space Agency. We've got a number of satellites that have been launched into space. And we're using those satellites to look at power infrastructure, to look at things like tower lines and high tension lines, to be able to predict when and if vegetation could become an issue, particularly when it relates to the impact of severe weather and hurricanes. We're going to look at probabilistic approaches to what is the risk to certain high tension lines, say coming into Corpus Christi, if say a Hurricane Harvey is headed toward the area. This section of power line has vegetation that's closer. It's this type of vegetation which is more susceptible to wind damage. And so the possibility of seeing critical infrastructure damage in this area is at a risk level that's here. And then at this area, the risk level is here. And kind of be able to give in advance of a storm somewhat of an outlook as to what kind of resources and what kind of timeline they're going to be looking at for restoration before the damage even occurs. And so that kind of business intelligence is something that is you're not going to find in one of your 500 free weather apps that you can get. It'll tell you it's sunny and 74. But it's the kind of business intelligence that's really actionable from a corporate standpoint, to be able to take action on that and be able to make a difference on both your bottom line and on your customers' performance. Obviously, power customers are relying on the power company to get things up as soon as possible. And regulators are involved as well. If a power company does not get a power restoration done in what's considered to be a timely manner, that tends to make regulators unhappy, and then it creates a whole host of problems for the power company as well. So it's in everyone's best interest to be able to effectively respond to these types of issues when they come along. In addition to that, and a lot of people may not be familiar with a private weather consulting firm. I know that some of you are. I've spoken with a number of you in the past. Just in case some of you aren't, very briefly, I'll go through why you really should have a private weather consultant if you are in business. As I mentioned, there's 500 free apps out there that'll tell you it's sunny and 74 today. Tomorrow, there's a 20% chance of thunderstorms, and it's going to be 78. And that's not really what we do at StormGeo. What we do at StormGeo is we work with Fortune 500 companies to help them understand the risks that their business faces from a business impact by the weather, and help them come up with tools, strategies, and information to help them mitigate that risk. So for somebody like a utility, that's a pretty obvious use case as to why would a utility need a weather consultancy. For somebody who's in, say, retail, there's a major retailer across the country. I could go ahead and say them. We don't have an NDA with them. It's Target. That uses our weather forecasts for a number of different applications. They use our weather forecasts for logistical supply chain, going all the way back to a number of their suppliers in Southeast Asia. If there's going to be a large storm across the North Pacific that could delay shipments getting into the ports of Long Beach or Seattle and impact inventory in the stores in Ohio, they'll start shipping more stuff out from their DCs to cover that slowdown of the shipping chain. They also use us onshore, obviously, for that shipping chain, getting from their distribution to the stores. If there's going to be major weather disruptions on certain interstate routes, they might reroute trucks to different routes. All the way down to, they have an app that they use for their business to customer level inside the store called Cartwheel. And that app has integration with short-term weather provided by us that will do things like look at future radar, predict that a storm may be moving toward a store, and pop up with an instant coupon in that store, good for the next 30 minutes, 20% off umbrellas over the next hour. And the client would, and they will be able to move more merchandise that way, and do it in an intelligent way. They're able to look at our 2 to 3 day forecasts and determine, are they going to need additional sunscreen, or are they going to need additional coolers, or whatever it is that they might need, and get that stuff shipped just in time to get to the store. Well, just in time, provided that we're not living in the age of COVID like we are. If you're in a sector like banking, that's another one that I like to use as an example. Why would a bank need a weather forecasting consultancy? Well, banks have a number of employees and a number of branches all across the country. And in this day and age where it's important to keep track of your workforce and knowing where they are, you're going to want to use things like big data aggregation of where your entire workforce is. And we have a major bank called Regions Bank that is a client of ours, and they have all of their employees' homes inside of a database, a proprietary database on their side, that they collide weather information from us. So, for example, in the Nashville tornado outbreak that we had last month, they were able to instantaneously overlay tornado tracks from the NexRad radars with their employee houses to find out if any of their employees may have been impacted, and do a status check on those employees to be able to see if they were okay or if they need any kind of assistance. You also, in a hurricane situation, obviously the first thing that emergency officials tell you to do when you're getting ready to evacuate is go to your bank and get cash, because after the storm, electronics won't be working and you may not be able to use an ATM. So the banks want to make sure that their customers have access to their money ahead of a storm, so they'll send cash money down to those ATMs in the coastal areas ahead of an evacuation. But they don't necessarily want to have that cash still sitting around in those ATMs after the storm has made landfall, and have Billy Bob and his two buddies with a pickup truck show up and drive off with that ATM full of cash. So they'll use intelligent information from us to know when is the time that we need to be sending the cash to the coast And then when do we need to be pulling that cash back out just before landfall, but after most of our clients have already gotten their money and left the area? It's kind of a narrow window there of where you would want to do that. And we help our clients work with that. If you're a healthcare corporation, why would a hospital necessarily need weather intelligence? Well, one look at the Joplin tornado would provide some clear definition on why a hospital would need that kind of intelligence. And it does present an obvious use case that if you're in a hospital, you don't want to be in the middle of a medical procedure when a tornado goes by nearby and cuts out the power. You want to be prepared for that kind of thing. And so there is a lot of short fuse warning type stuff that we do for them. But another thing that we do is just related to being able to work with them when they have cases like this COVID situation they're dealing with now, where they've got unusual work patterns. They've closed a number of clinics. They've relocated some of their people. They've got some of their people in less than hardened environments, outside in tents, doing triage and testing. And we're able to take that information, incorporate those changes, and provide them with atypical intelligence to help them be able to know, okay, look, a 30-mile-an-hour wind gust ordinarily wouldn't cause you any problems at the hospital. But if you've got 4 or 5 different tents set up out in the parking lot to get ready to do triage, all of a sudden that 30-mile-an-hour wind can be a real problem. And so we need to know where those facilities are. And we work with our clients to find out where they are and go ahead and provide them with that information that they need. Moving to the offshore environment, there's an obvious use case there as well. And the use case there in the offshore environment is wind and wave. The Weather Service's forecasts in the offshore environment are very generalized and broad, and there are very few free applications that focus on the marine environment in any kind of a holistic or cohesive way. And so the marine interest is a very easy sell. In fact, most offshore oil and gas requires at least one weather provider to maintain their insurance. So that there is a pretty easy case for us to make to our clients. In terms of tropical information, again, the mission of our organization is to provide business intelligence to our clients, which is a little bit different mission than what the Hurricane Center's mission is. The Hurricane Center's mission is protection of life and property. Our mission isn't general protection of life and property of the general public. Our mission is to provide actionable business intelligence to our clients. You might think there's not much difference between those two, but there very often is. I'll cite a couple of examples. One of them is a prototypical situation where you have a major hurricane that has come through the Florida Straits and is moving through the south central Gulf of Mexico, recurving toward the north. This has happened a number of times with us. The Hurricane Center is going to bring that storm across New Orleans in almost every use case because New Orleans takes the longest to evacuate. They require the longest amount of lead time to do so. And so the course of least regret is to act as if and assume that it's going to hit New Orleans. And then if it doesn't, the worst that happens is you've inconvenienced a few people and spent a little bit of extra money, as opposed to saying that it's not going to hit New Orleans and then having it hit New Orleans, and then your worst case scenario is Katrina. So the Hurricane Center is almost always in that use case going to be bringing the storm near or over New Orleans to emphasize that threat to New Orleans. Whereas our business interests might be that, we've got refineries along the coast of Mississippi and Alabama in Mobile Bay that need to know that storm is more likely to head that way than it is toward New Orleans. And so we're a little bit freer to do the actual meteorology. Even if the ensemble tracks are all east of New Orleans, the Hurricane Center is going to have their official forecast track to New Orleans. But we're able to say, the ensembles are a little bit east and they've been trending east. I don't necessarily know that you need to worry about New Orleans so much as you need to worry about, say, Pascagoula, Biloxi, Mobile, somewhere over there. And there's been a number of use cases where facilities that would not have taken precautions in, say, Mobile Bay for a storm heading toward New Orleans were told by us that it's more likely to head toward Mobile Bay, took their precautions, and saved themselves a lot of time, money, and headache by having their facility prepared and hardened. Another example that I'll use a little bit more recent was Dorian from this past season. Dorian was gradually, slowly creeping across the Bahamas, moving westward at about a half a knot. And we had gotten all of our clients nice and gentle and acclimated to the idea that this storm was going to be turning toward the north that night and then staying off the Florida East Coast and recurving out towards sea. And then all of a sudden, late in the afternoon, our phones just exploded. And it was with a number of our hospital and healthcare clients who were telling us that they had just gotten off the call with the state of Florida and that the state meteorologist had told them that the storm was expected to make landfall in Palm Beach County as a Category 5 the next day. And they were like, what the heck? This is the first thing we're hearing about this. Why didn't you tell us? And we had to kind of say, well, we didn't tell you that because we don't think that's what's going to happen. We think it's going to recurve. And so it took about 2 or 3 hours of consulting with all of our clients in the area to get them calmed down, and did a little bit of investigating after the fact. Of course, we all know Dorian did recurve. It did not make landfall in Palm Beach as a Category 5 hurricane. And did a little research after the fact and come to find out that the state was not happy that a number of the nursing homes in South Florida were not evacuating patients as a precaution in case it did do that. And so they leaned on the state meteorologists to change the forecast for the state to try and get those facilities to take some preventive action. So it was more of a political decision and forecast than it was a meteorological or scientific decision or forecast. And, our clients were effluent in their praise after that for, knowing that they can turn to us and get the real story and get something, what is the actual best thought of what's actually going to happen without any of the other factors that can go into a public forecast. So our Tropics Watch forecast is a very valuable component of our service offering to our clients, and that it provides a very professional second opinion to our end users to be able to differentiate from what the general public is doing and acting on, and be able to advantage that for their organizations. As you can imagine, with this whole COVID-19 change of everything, change of our entire culture really that we've gone through over the past month to month and a half, our organization has been a fairly forward-leaning one, and we were able to pull all of our non-meteorologists, non-operational forecasters out as early as May 9th. We were telling our non-meteorologists to pull out and work from home to minimize exposure in the workplace. And then within a week or two after that, we were able to transition our entire forecasting desk to work from home as well. So all of our forecasters are currently working from home. They have full connectivity to our operations facilities and computers in the office. The office is technically open, although no one is reporting to work there. If somebody were to experience a catastrophic loss of power or internet and not be able to get a hold of anybody, they are able to go into the office and finish their shift and keep serving our clients. I intentionally have 2 forecasters on duty at all times, and I have them geographically separated in different parts of town so that a local power outage doesn't take out both of them at the same time. And they're all working on battery backups and all of the other precautions that we can take. But much like you guys are finishing your semester from home, we're finishing our work every day from home as well. And it's going to be a little bit challenging, I think, moving forward in terms of do we leave that as an option, or do we go back to having a fully staffed office at all times? I think that's a conversation we're probably going to be needing to have. So very briefly, I will round out my talk. Think I'm hopeful that this slideshow is going to work and that it has finally downloaded. And let me go back to here and see if I can get this to share the proper screen. I am familiar with Zoom, but it is a little bit of a challenge when you're trying to do PowerPoint as well. So let's see if this works. Okay, that seems to be working.
Looks good.
Okay. All right, so this is this is what we're showing our clients for our 2019 hurricane season review and our outlook for the 2020 season, just to give you an idea of the kind of products that we put out for our clients that are more generalized, and to kind of give you a little bit of a feeling of what it is that we do for our clients. So the 2019 hurricane season, obviously Dorian was the highlight. There it is right before our phones exploded, and that's anecdote that I was just relating to you guys. So the 2019 season had what we're calling above normal activity, but there were several weak and short-lived storms that many of which probably didn't need to be classified and named, to be perfectly honest with you. There were a number of lows that were, our hurricane expert, Chris Hebert, likes to say, well, we were predicting 14 storms, and we had 18 storms, but 2 of them were West Gulf lows. 1 of them had an occlusion. So we were really pretty close on to what we were expecting at the beginning of the season. So you can see that our forecast was for a fairly typical to maybe slightly below normal season of 14, 6, and 2. We ended up with 18, 6, and 3. But 7 of the 18 named storms were 24 hours or less. 1 of them had only 3 hours. And then 2 of the 6 hurricanes lasted less than 12 hours as well. The past 4 seasons were above average in terms of the ACE, that's accumulated cyclonic energy. Major hurricanes Dorian and Lorenzo really helped drive that number in 2019, but it would have been a below normal season had we not had those outliers. So I'm going to not spend a whole lot of time here talking about some of these past storms, every single one of them. There's Andrea, May 20th. It was a 12 to 18-hour storm. You guys all remember Andrea, don't you? It was a real highlight of the season. You can see there. I think he picked that picture with the long gust front intentionally, just to show the lack of real cohesive organization with that storm. Barry was a brief pop-up hurricane that was out there for maybe 18 hours. Note that though it didn't have any deaths reported, it produced $600 million in damage. So even these shorter, quick-lived storms can produce quite a bit of damage if they hit in the right spot. About once every 2 years, we see a storm that's of the type of Barry. This slide is really intending to remind our clients that not every hurricane is this nice, long track, starts off the Azores and marches its way across the Atlantic over the course of 2.5 weeks, major events, and that they need to be prepared for these more short fuse type situations. Again, Barry was unique in that it came from an MCS that moved off the coast and then came back to the coast. Doing quite a bit of overview on Barry here. You can see that this is one of our products that we use that's unique to our organization, called TRAC. A TRAC is an acronym that stands for Threatened Region from Active Cyclone. And what it's doing is it's taking the ECMWF, the GFS, and the Canadian ensembles, and it's predicting in a heat map fashion where the most likelihood is of that storm center going over the next 5 to 7 days, depending on which of the 2 products you're looking at. So here you can see we had a very good feeling that it was going to be coming out across the Florida Panhandle, moving across the Northern Gulf, and then coming back into Louisiana. And that is actually what it ended up doing. So that's a very handy product for our clients. and it's a proprietary product that they only get from us. So we all remember Dorian. I especially think that storm chaser that was hanging out there on Great Abaco is going to remember Dorian for a long, 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 long time. One of the strongest hurricanes to ever make landfall in the Atlantic. There it is, right up there, tied with the Labor Day, and it was a much larger storm than the Labor Day was. So there's a definite upward trend in the number of Atlantic basin hurricanes, but why is that? There's the long-term trend line with slightly positive slope. U.S. hurricane landfall is more common. Not really. We've seen an increase actually in storms that, or at least the ratio of storms that have been identified as landfalling offshore or remaining offshore. And you can see there's the slope of that trend line as well. So we had 2 in 2017, 1 in 2018. There's no real significant trend line there. We did have a fairly large gap, 12 years in here. You can see that historically that's a very long gap to go without a major hurricane landfall. So we don't really see that there's necessarily a lot more major hurricane landfalls going on. It's just we think that we're going to see a lot of increased activity because we're detecting and we're acting on a lot more systems that we would not have in the past, both because of increases in satellite frequency of imagery and quality of imagery. The new GOES-R imagery is light years above what we had just a couple years ago. But in addition, we're also seeing an increase in things like scatterometers and the new Cygnus system that's up there that is looking at things in a much more frequent manner and able to pick out circulations that may not have been classified in the past. So this was Imelda. We could just blow through Imelda. I mean, it only formed in mid-September. It was only a named system for 6 hours. Weak little system formed off the Texas Gulf Coast. No real problem there, is there? Well, there's the problem from Imelda. It doesn't really take a major hurricane to produce some major impact. And we had a Doppler radar estimate of 44 inches just near the Beaumont area. And those folks out there in the Beaumont area saw significant flooding impacts from Imelda. Fortunately, the impacts were much more localized than they were during Harvey. These are 4-day precipitation estimates of Harvey compared to Imelda. Obviously, Harvey was a much larger and much greater, more overreaching geographical impact than what Imelda was. But where Imelda did have an impact, it had a significant impact. And in that Beaumont, Port Arthur area, there was a significant impact from rainfall from Imelda. Lorenzo was the second strongest hurricane of 2019, but is very remarkable and unmemorable. Even for our shipping interests, it stayed away from most of the shipping lanes. It was very isolated and didn't really cause a whole lot of problems for any paying clients. Nestor was declared a tropical storm on October 18th, shortly before it moved inland. But this is a good example of one of those storms that we probably could have been just as well off if we hadn't gone through all the trouble of naming and tracking it as a tropical storm. You can see it is a well-developed low, but it's clearly got some non-tropical characteristics going with it at this present time, at the time of this image at least. And it caused little in the way of damage as it moved across the southeast. Olga was another one that lasted 6 hours as a tropical storm. It was very difficult to identify on satellite. Again, it was mainly identified due to scatterometry imagery, seeing a fairly tight core that they determined by doing temperature analysis was enough of a warm core to go ahead and name it, but it was really a bit of a non-starter in terms of impact. And then toward the end of the season, NHC began naming formerly non-tropical lows in the far northeast Atlantic. There was a trio of them out there, Melissa, Rebecca, and Sebastian. that got, as you can see, increasingly, you could probably make a decent case for Rebecca that it had shed its front and was an actual tropical enough low to be doing advisories on at that point. But as you can see, as time went on, Rebecca and then Sebastian, those decisions got a little bit more questionable. Another of those formerly non-tropical lows became Hurricane Pablo in the far eastern Atlantic late in October, and that was the capper for the 2019 season. So looking ahead to the 2020 season, our tropical expert, Chris Hebert, is expecting that there's a number of factors that we're going to have to look at to provide that forecast for 2020. Are we going to see a El Nino or La Nina? That's obviously one of the biggest considerations that you see to kind of start your trend up or down from there. You're going to look at water temperatures in the deep tropics. The Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation plays a big part, as does the strength of the Bermuda High. If the Bermuda High is too strong, the waves are moving too fast, and you don't see any development out there. And then we're going to look at some analog seasons, looking at all of these factors as to where we're going to go with the forecast. So sea surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific have been above normal for the past couple seasons, but that may be ending this season. We are seeing a little bit of a cool down in the tropical Pacific, which would kind of take El Nino a little bit more off the table than what we've seen recently. And the multi-model plots suggesting that it's going to be in a neutral to possibly cool phase for the El Nino during the peak of the upcoming Atlantic season. So we are using those models at only a 21% chance of an El Nino during the peak season. And most likely, as mentioned, it's going to be neutral to possibly even a little bit on the cool side. And water temperatures across the Atlantic are above normal right now, while they're trending even cooler in the eastern tropical Pacific. So that means that you start with more fuel on the ground for storms to be able to use. Oceanic heat content's considerably higher this year, particularly in the central and western Caribbean. And this is the delta on the oceanic heat content, showing that it has increased quite a bit in that same area over what it was this time last year. And we're going to look at atmospheric instability here. More instability, obviously, you get more thunderstorms, a greater chance of development. The Atlantic right now is stable, but it's moving toward normal. Caribbean Sea really is already in more of a normal phase. The Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, there's a mouthful to say properly while you're on a recorded webinar. It's a salinity-driven current of warm water. Over a period of decades, the warm water in the northern Atlantic melts the ice, and that changes the salinity. More ice forms, increasing the salinity as the current flows faster, it melts the ice again. So it goes up and down as over a multi-decadal time frame. Atlantic naturally warms and cools over periods of 25 to 40 years. Warm cycles produce more major hurricanes. Atlantic shifted to a cool cycle in 2013, and we're still in a cool cycle as of February. There you can see a little bit of the sine wave overlaid on top of the scientific data. The ECMWF is predicting near normal rainfall across the main development region. That's actually more favorable than what we've seen over recent years. Recent years have really featured fairly extensive Saharan air layer outbreaks during the peak of the season that have really helped to quash any kind of development in the August and September timeframe for the most part. A return to near normal conditions there is actually a little bit of a leading indicator towards saying it could be a busier season. The ECMWF has also approached forecasting that the ACE, or accumulated cyclonic energy, is going to be 90% of normal through October. So a near normal ACE season. Again, last year we ended up near normal because of two bigger storms. This year we might end up more normal because it's spread out over a more active season. ECMWF's prediction is 12.3 total storms through October and 6.1 hurricanes through October. And our analog years favor a relatively inactive season number-wise, though, possibly with one or two long-tracked major hurricanes. These are years that we've gone back in the past and looked at all of those various factors that we talked about at the top of the talk and identified years that had very similar conditions and then looked at what the actual tropical activity was during those years. And then we use those years a little bit of like a benchmark as to what is possible to expect. You can see that looking at the analogs this year, they're a little bit all over the place. One of them was as low as 8 named storms, and another one was as many as 16. So the signals are a little bit mixed. If you went straight with the analogs, it would still be trending toward, on the average, a little bit less than normal. There were 5 U.S. hurricane strikes in the 5 analog years. There was a high incidence, however, of Cuban impacts. Remember, we saw that graphic earlier about the higher than normal and higher than recently normal oceanic heat content there in the central and western Caribbean. So as I mentioned, the signals are mixed for the seasonal forecast. We have a cool phase of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation right now. Some of the analog years were inactive, but there's no El Nino this season. And there's above normal water temperatures in the western Caribbean Sea, and especially in the Gulf of Mexico. Some of the analog years were fairly active. So there's a real question as to how many storms we can expect to see as we work through the upcoming year. And another factor to consider, as we mentioned, is you're not only having to forecast what is the tropics going to do, you're having to forecast what is the hurricane center going to do about what the tropics is going to do. So you have to take that into account, that you're probably going to toss an extra 1 or 2 or 3 storms on top of your pile of what you think the actual tropical forecast would be, to account for the naming of occluded lows, frontal lows, MCSs, anything else that seems to tickle their fancy through the year. And then once you've come up with a number of storms forecasts, you kind of have to figure out where is it going to go. One of the leading indicators that we have for forecasting the track tendencies of a given season is to look at the soil moisture anomalies. Typically speaking, wetter soil leads to lower pressure, leads to enhanced troughiness in that area, leads to weaknesses in that area that allow storms to recurve in that direction. And so looking at the soil moisture anomalies, one would expect that most likely this summer we're going to be seeing a trough axis over the east central U.S. that would tend to guide any storms that do happen to form in the northwestern Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico more northward than westward. So more likely to go toward the north central or northeastern Gulf of Mexico than they would be to go toward the western Gulf of Mexico. So our official forecast is for above normal activity this year. Normal would be 14, 7, and 3. Given all of those factors that we just discussed, we're going with a forecast of 16, 8, and 4. Your risk areas are primarily going to be above normal risk across the eastern Yucatan, the areas of Cuba based on the analog seasons and the high oceanic heat content in those areas, and then areas in the northern and northeastern Gulf, the Bahamas, and the southeastern U.S., again, based on those soil anomalies that we tend to become steering mechanisms for anything that does develop out of the Caribbean Sea or the southwestern Atlantic Ocean. You'll notice that we do have one bifurcated track that goes across the Yucatan Peninsula and heads toward northeastern Mexico. Sometimes with the soil moisture, you still get systems that don't quite get caught up by that trough, especially if they're strong enough to create a little bit of a ridge themselves, kind of pump up that ridge itself to the north. And so there is a potential for a stronger, long track type of hurricane that would impact the Yucatan and then move toward northeastern Mexico. So our names for 2020, it's the same list that we had in 2008 and 2014 with the obvious retirements that come from those years. Ike's replacement is pronounced Isaias. And we didn't reach it in 2014, so we could see our first Isaias of all time later this year if our forecast does end up being correct. Gonzalo replaces Gustav, and Paulette replaces Paloma. So that ends our hurricane season outlook for for 2020. It also is going to round out my introduction to StormGeo for you guys. I hope you guys learned a little bit more about private weather consulting firms and what they do. I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you guys might have at this time.
Awesome, thank you. Does anyone have any questions to start us off?
I have a couple questions.
Sure, go ahead.
I noticed when you were in the very top of your talk, you were explaining that you had offices in Scotland and you had offices in you had acquired one in Brazil, and you also had one in, I think you said Gaia, and you, of course, there's one in Houston. But I didn't notice that you had mentioned anything in Australia or any place in Asia or in the Far East. Do y'all collaborate with them to try to get some what's going on with the shipping?
We have a number of sales offices in those
Okay.
regions, in Australia and all up and down the Far East, obviously, with how big manufacturing and shipping is in those areas.
Right.
We just don't have operational forecast centers
Okay.
in those locations. The operational forecasting is handled from the other locations. I do know that our shipping division is looking at starting a forecaster operation in Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
My cynical opinion of that is that they probably think the forecasters can be getting a little bit cheaper in Thailand than they can be elsewhere, and you can start to move some of the work that way. That just seems to be the cynical trend of globalization across the globe, is to find lower cost environments in which to do your work.
Okay. All right. And my second question is, you stated that you were going to team up with, I believe you said it was a company that did a space. I mean, they were going to do satellites. It's a space company, correct?
It's the European Space Agency. It's essentially the EU's version of NASA.
Okay, so if you start looking at satellites, are y'all going to also dip into space weather then?
Most likely not. We do dabble in that just a little bit. One of our experts here in the Houston office, Fred Schmoody, knows quite a bit about space weather, and so he's kind of the organization's go-to guy for any questions that we get related to that. But the questions that we get that are related to that are largely more, what is space weather's impact on terrestrial operations going to be?
Right. Okay. And then I guess my final question will be, when you were talking about how you guys coordinate, let's say like you were saying with Target and with different banks and stuff like that, you mainly just give them the weather, the logistics side. Does that mainly come on their end, or does that, or is it sort of a shared, or do you guys do some logistics as well, or is it mainly one side rather than y'all?
Well, we really work with the clients on a case-by-case basis, really, to come up with and understand where their potential vulnerabilities are. We do have some clients that are knowledgeable, and they come to us saying exactly what they need, and they know that we need this information, we need it this way, and it has to come in this format, it has to come on this cadence, and we're happy to provide that data as a background feed to them if they want to pull that into their own applications and just use that information. But in most cases, a client comes to us and they say, we have this challenge, and we're not quite sure how to overcome it. I mean, we know what the challenge is. We have some ideas as to how we would think to overcome it, but as laymen, we really don't know. And you would be surprised how many companies we work with that have a hurricane plan, a hurricane response plan that goes something along the lines of, when the storm is 7 days out, take this action. 7 days out from what? 7 days out from making landfall? 7 days out from starting to have impacts? 7 days out from maybe heading this way? And what do you do about the storm that forms and it's only 2 days out? You know? Or it'll say, once the storm is within 750 nautical miles, you should spend $50,000 on supplies just in case. Well, there's plenty of times where a storm can be 100 nautical miles away and it's sunny and it's not coming your way because the meteorological situation is such that there's a trough that's already swung between you and the center of circulation. There ain't no way it's ever going to come your way. And so that company has just gone out and spent $50,000. They've spent an entire year's worth of consulting with us on something that they didn't even need to react to. And so that's where the expertise that we can provide them in terms of the planning phase, well in advance of the actual response phase, really pays off, where they're able to come to experts and we're able to provide them with statistical guidance and important guidance that says, okay, if your probability of seeing 39-mile-an-hour winds never gets above 7%, then you never need to go to phase 4 of your plan, which is where you start spending serious money. And if the probability of wind impact is above 7% and the forecasted storm size is such and such, then you should go ahead and spend that money. And we will provide them with every storm advisory, a report that tells them all of those statistics and how they're changing and gives them guidance on what action they should be taking.
Okay.
I was hoping to show you one of those trigger reports today. Unfortunately, the network drive communication is not such that I was able to get that PowerPoint working.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
No worries.
I have a question. If you could, sort of just tell us like your educational and career background and sort of like the path that you took to get to the position you have today.
Okay. Times were a little bit, come around, kiddies, and listen to a story from somebody who's ancient. Times were a little bit different when I was graduating. When I was graduating, a bachelor's degree was perfectly sufficient to be able to break into the field, either in the Weather Service or in the private sector. When I graduated, the National Weather Service had always been my intended destination. I graduated with a bachelor's from Florida State in 1996. And my intention was to go into the Weather Service. They were in a hiring freeze in 1996 when I graduated. And so instead of going into the Weather Service, I ended up going into the private sector. And in the private sector, they were more than happy to take somebody with a bachelor's degree, a good head on their shoulders, and good communication skills. And I spent a number of years working at a small forecasting company in the New York Hudson Valley for what generally amounted to peanuts. Really, I was just building a resume to what I hoped would be a jump to the Weather Service when the hiring freeze ended. I wanted to at least have a foot in the door in the field. So it was a fairly low-paying job, but it allowed me to get some forecasting chops and get some, cut my teeth on some actual professional forecasting. And before I managed to get into the Weather Service, I managed to get a job offer here with what was then Impact Weather in Houston. And Impact Weather took a much more professional long-term view of its staff. And so I was able to make a professional living out of being a weather forecaster in the private sector, and gradually just rose up through the forecasting ranks. I worked on a forecasting desk in New York for 8 years, and then I came here to Texas and I worked on a forecasting desk for another 3, and then I became the offshore supervisor who was handling a lot of the offshore management work, and then I became the offshore manager who was handling both of the teams and doing more product development. And then I became the operations director who has responsibility for 30 forecasters that are working on all 3 of those teams, plus the other broadcast specialists and client service specialists and everyone else in the office who is forward facing toward the client. And really, it's just been a gradual, natural progression of, more responsibility as I've succeeded with the responsibility that I've been given.
Awesome. Thank you.
So again, I would encourage all of you guys in the Weather Service these days, from what I understand, you can't even make a panel without either a master's degree or a large amount of outside experience to make up for not having the master's degree. So even if you're considering operational forecasting, I would certainly encourage you guys to consider going for a master's degree. In the private sector, especially, at least as far as I'm concerned, I don't think getting in with a bachelor's is anything that's a negative. I think if you've got the right attitude, the right communication skills, having a bachelor's degree is perfectly sufficient for an operational forecasting job in the private sector. But if you're hoping to eventually move to the Weather Service, you're pretty much going to need a master's. And having one certainly doesn't hurt your chances in the private sector. We have a number of our forecasters in the Houston office that have advanced degrees. And globally, pretty much all of the forecasters in Europe, for example, have advanced degrees, simply because in Europe, they pretty much pay you to keep going to school. So people just keep going to school. If you're going to get paid to go to school, why would you get paid to work if you can get paid to go to school? So I would encourage you guys, if you're considering going into operational forecasting, to consider at least pursuing an advanced degree before going into that. And if not, the main places you want to be focusing on are your communication skills and your risk management skills.
Is there any like particular way you would recommend gaining experience in risk management skills per se? Or and I know you've mentioned the communication skills a lot too, and at our university we do have like the broadcast track and then the general track. So what are some other like tips or ways you would have for students that are on the general track and not necessarily doing work all the time on a green screen? What sort of like advice would you have as far as like the communication on that aspect too?
There's a big difference between broadcast skills and communication skills. I would start by emphasizing that. I go back to when I was taking a weathercasting class, when I was taking a broadcasting class, in college, in the communications department. And it was always an interesting mix there, because you had the meteorology students who were trying to figure out the broadcasting, and you had the broadcasting students who were trying to figure out the meteorology. And one of the top broadcasting students was just having the most terrible time understanding lighting, understanding the way that you had to position lights and stuff in order to eliminate shadows. It's basic mathematics to the meteorology students. So we were just like, come on. But she actually blurted out after almost a day and a half of this, don't get this. At all. And she's one of the top communication students. And if you turn the camera on her, she knew how to smile, and she knew how to stand, and she knew how to move her hands. But in terms of actual communication skills, having to talk to a client or something like that when they're trying to make a multi-million-dollar decision on whether or not they need to close or mitigate their facility, not the first option that I would have gone for. So communication skills really is about, it does involve presentation. It involves being able to understand your body language. But it also involves just being able to speak in a conversational tone and with confidence and be comfortable presenting a storm scenario to what is the business equivalent of a five-star general. There are times that we get on there. We've been on calls with the CEO of Walmart or the CEO of Target. Or in my previous job, I got yelled at during Schindler's List by Steven Spielberg. When is this rain going to stop? Dude, you're shooting in Vancouver in January. I'm in marketing, not production. I can't tell you when the rain is going to stop. I can only tell you when the rain is going to stop. I can't make it stop for you. So, risk management, there are courses that you can take on risk management, on business continuity. Those kind of approaches will teach you basic risk management skills. It's important to understand and know that risk management is really mostly about mitigation, much more so than about total avoidance. You're never going to be able to totally avoid risk. It's more about making sure that your risk you're taking is appropriate. Believe it or not, a background in things like poker or Dungeons and Dragons, even board games, will give you the ability to assess risk versus reward in ways that people who don't have that background or experience don't have. So a lot of it is formalized training that you can go through and do. I'm sure that Texas A&M Corpus Christi has a business continuity type of program, and taking a basic class in business continuity basics or program management basics. I'm right now going through the project management certification process, and a lot of that is really just about assessing risk and proper planning. And you would be surprised how many people out there don't have those skills and don't have that skill set.
Yeah, I thank you for mentioning that, because I think that's a skill or like experience that's not really mentioned that much as far as like developing your package when applying
Your
for
toolkit, yeah.
exactly. Talk about GIS and emergency management and communication skills and stuff like that all the time. But now that you explained it like that, I can see why that's really important.
Yep.
Anyone else have any questions? So going back to more of like what like your toolkit and making you a competitive applicant, how much does previous like internship or research experience, stuff like that matter? And does it matter more so if you have like experience for volunteering with the National Weather Service versus an internship experience with a private sector company?
Well, I hate to make any kind of blanket statements because I certainly can't speak for anyone besides myself.
Right.
One of the things that I see a lot of, especially recently, are these paid boondoggle research experiences that, a professor from such and such college took his class to China to study upper air pollution. And, everyone who had the ability to pay and had the ability to take the summer off and go do that was able to put that on their resume for resume padding, Those to me carry less weight than, quite frankly, working at a convenience store over the summer. Because to me, somebody who's got the initiative to work at a convenience store or work in a retail job or something like that over the summer has work ethic. And that's something that you can't really teach somebody. They either have it or they don't. So I'm always much more interested in people that can demonstrate even if it's through a weather service volunteer internship or paid internship, that's great. That's operational forecasting. Those are very competitive positions. So that means that somebody else has already done some of the legwork for me in terms of this person is going to at least be able to form coherent sentences and get through an interview process to get an internship position at the Weather Service. So those are good. But, spent a summer studying coral in the Bahamas. That doesn't really do a whole lot for me.
I have a question, Jacob.
Sure.
My question is this: throughout my academic career, I've done projects or been involved in projects that are outside the purview of meteorology, but they do involve science. For example, I did several projects having to do with GIS and having to do with mapping. Would that be a quality that you would look for? You could look at the applicant and say, well, they have the courage to dip outside the purview and yet do a very good job in what they did. Does that count as anything?
I think it's really a case by case basis. If it's a skill set that is, relevant to what the organization is looking for, GIS is obviously a highly relevant skill set. In pretty much any private sector application. GIS is really what makes the world go round at this point. So that, yes, that would be a very salient, if you'll pardon the pun, skill set to be listing. At the very least, I would want to see that listed as your skill set on the front page of the resume. You might want to leave the actual experience of it to the second page,
Okay.
or toward the back, as opposed to, say, and I'm not trying to pick on people who study coral, but spent 3 years looking at water quality in Fiji.
Mm-hmm.
That's not very marketable. I don't have a whole lot of clients who are concerned about water quality in Fiji. I have a lot of clients that are concerned about our GIS capabilities.
Right.
I don't have a lot of clients that are concerned about water quality in Fiji. So it's really about how does what your skill set is and your experience is mesh with how it would help the organization that I'm representing and looking to move forward.
Okay.
That kind of brings up another important point. I mentioned this when I was at the career fair in the fall, but it bears repeating. You should be individualizing and customizing your resumes to the job application that you're applying for. I've been there. To some extent, I'm still there. It's very easy to just say, oh, that looks like an interesting opportunity. I'm just going to chuck on my resume and see if it flies. Really, in this day and age, you should be looking at every opportunity as the opportunity that you want to get, and taking the time to tailor your resume to that opportunity. Does this guy look like he would care about GIS? Yes, he does. I'm going to leave the GIS stuff in there. Does he look like he would care about water quality in Fiji? Probably not. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off, because I want to tailor that resume to really spike when it hits him. And in order to do that, it pays to take a half hour, look at that organization's website, Google them, for press releases, see what it is they're doing, who it is they're working with, and see how you can tie yourself into what it is that they're doing. That, more than anything else, is going to get your resume looked at.
Okay. Thank you.
While we're on the topic of resumes right now, and I know obviously, I guess I would just want your opinion on this personally, because obviously each hiring person or whatever is going to be different. But you mentioned like the retail and restaurants, convenience store jobs versus, and then like the internships too. So as far as like, when is it to the point where it's like too much stuff on a resume to where you get like overloaded? Because honestly, I've never personally put like my retail or restaurant job experience on my resume, even though I've worked some of those as recent as a couple years ago, and instead favored my internship experience in the favor of just simply space on the resume. Just sort of like what your thoughts are on that, and then if you have any like advice for like cover letters too, I guess. So obviously a lot of job applicants use the cover letter to supplement their resume.
So for me, the ideal length is you can have a cover letter that's up to a full page, and I'll read it in its entirety, and a 2-page resume. Those are, generally speaking, the required, that those are kind of the sweet spots for me. If you've got a lot of stuff and can go to a 3rd page on a resume, that's okay, as long as it's relevant stuff. But I would try not to go over 1 page on the cover letter, and I would try to keep it to 2 pages on the resume. And keep in mind that, when you're listing your resume, you can give more details in some stuff and less detail in others. So your section for retail doesn't have to be 7 bullet points on retail. It can be, a section underneath the ones that you want to highlight that just says other work experience, and just lists them out, as individual bullet points: this restaurant, this store, this whatever. And if you know, everyone is going to be different. Some people are going to really value those research, those paid research junkets. Other people won't. It really depends on what the philosophy and academic bent of the individual reviewing that resume is going to be, and quite frankly, it might, as I mentioned earlier, do you good to do a little bit of research, and if you can figure out who is going to be the person evaluating that resume, or who's going to be on the committee making the decision of ranking those resumes, find out a little bit about those people to try and find out what kind of people they are. Everybody leaves a digital footprint in this day and age.
Awesome. Thank you. Anyone else with questions?
I have one. Since we're about to lecture on this, I did take note that some of your clients deal with long-term probability decision making. How much are you leaning toward the numerical models for teleconnection patterns, including El Nino, Pacific North Oscillation, those type of metrics?
I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I am not a long-range forecaster. I'm a little bit of an administrator when it comes to this. That's just a branch that I never came up through. And to me, it has always been, it seemed to me to be a little bit like chicken entrails, or, you know, rolling bones, or auguring to try and figure out what the heck is going to happen, you know, 6 months from now or 9 months from now. We do have experts in our office who focus on all of those teleconnections. We've got 2 or 3 guys who are whip smart on that stuff, and they have a lot of belief and experience in it. And I've seen the results they come up with. They're not perfect. No forecaster is perfect. But more often than not, they're able to predict not so much, you know, we're going to see 0.76 inches of rain on October 19th. I mean, you know, AccuWeather's trying to come out with a 45-day, day-by-day, hour-by-hour forecast that quote unquote does that. That's not so much. But if you want to ask someone, is it going to be warmer or colder than normal? Is it going to be windier or less windy than normal? They've got a pretty good track record of being able to predict those larger, longer term trends by looking at all of those teleconnections and looking at where the MJO is and looking at where the MJO is predicted to be, and coming up with all of those teleconnections. That there's so many acronyms that it just makes my head spin. Yeah. Fortunately, from a personal level, I've been blessed enough to kind of just be their boss, who says, you guys are smart, keep doing the smart thing. I want to be brush my pointy hair over here in the corner and let you guys do your thing. You guys do what you do best, and I'll make sure you guys get the recognition for it.
Okay. But it is safe to say that it sounds like that's becoming more and more valuable in the business.
It is. It's a very valuable skill set, and people are constantly trying to push the envelope. I remember when I was, one of the first professional calls that I got in 1996 after I graduated was some person who just found us in a phone book or on the internet or something and called and said her daughter was getting married in Bermuda on June 18th. And this was like, I don't know, January 4th or something. And she wanted a forecast for her daughter's wedding. You know, I had to tell her 80% chance of sunshine, 19% chance of showers, and 1% chance of a hurricane. You know, because what you're looking for, and we're still not there to this point in terms of being able to predict actual identifiable daily weather that far out, obviously. But it moves in that direction, and business is constantly trying to push the envelope on. You know, we you know, I just did a hurricane seasonal outlook and the reason we put out a seasonal hurricane outlook is because every single one of our clients wants to know what's the hurricane season going to look like this year. So it's something that is becoming quickly a basic expectation to have in your competency set if you're going to represent yourself as a professional forecaster.
Okay. All right. Very interesting. Thank you.
No worries.
Does anyone else have one or two quick last questions?
I think he explained everything quite efficiently, in my opinion.
All right. All right. Well, if you guys have any questions, Jacob has my email address. You feel free to drop me a line anytime, and I'll be happy to answer them for you.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again very much for taking your time out of your evening to speak to us. I know it was very helpful with the advice on resume packages and like toolkits, but obviously it was also really cool to see the hurricane outlook and more about what kind of stuff y'all do. So I really appreciate it, and I know everyone else here does too as well. So thank you.
Hey, I'm working in my home office 24/7 at this point, so I just had to step outside, and everything was all set up for me. Easy to do.
Awesome. So yeah, once again, I'll have his email. If you guys have any questions at all, then feel free to reach out to him. But other than that, that's all I have for you guys. You guys take care, stay safe, and then just again a reminder about the officer nominations. So those close tomorrow night, and then our next talk is next. Awesome.
Okay.
All right.
That sounds good.
Thank you very much. You guys have a nice night.
Y'all have a good
Yeah.
night. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.